begin by thinking about power, because this passage is power unleashed. Every second, 167 trillion horsepowers of energy reach us from the sun. 167 trillion. Now that's impressive, but not when you realize that's only 1 to 2 billion of its output. If you doubled our solar input, that would be the end of life on Earth. That's power. And then you think about the sun as a star, its cousins. We don't know, we estimate 100 trillion galaxies. Best estimates, it's amazing we pay people to do this, is 1 septillion stars. That's a 1 with 27 zeros. And how did that come about? Let there be light in the expanse of the heaven. 10 words. And then you think about the life that sustains. I'm thinking of aquatic life today, 2.2 million species estimated. We're so amazing in human beings, we've discovered 9%. And you think, well, that's because we don't live there. We've only discovered 14% of the estimated 6.5 million species on land. I have a science degree. I smile, realizing that the vast majority of the life God's created we will never see till heaven. God just made species and we'll never discover them. That's His power. And how did those aquatic species come about? Just 11 words. Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. That's power. With that as a background, you and I can understand what Paul says, because Paul is going to say that in the gospel, God unleashes His power. He has greatest power. I can say this, it did not cost God anything to create the heavens and the earth, or species. But it cost Him His Son to unleash His power in the gospel. Verses 16 and 17 are the thesis, they're the center, they're the main argument of Romans. I know Paul has given us 14 verses of introduction. This is the main heart of Romans, and from here forth, Paul is going to say, this is what I'm talking about. And so I don't typically do this, but I want to show you how I get these points from this text, because this is the key to Romans, and I will refer back to this many times. Now, inspired by the 10 words that created the stars and the 11 words that created life on earth, I thought maybe I could put the gospel in 11 words. And so here's what I want to say, that it's the promised power of God that creates faith and gives righteousness. This gospel is the power promised by God that creates faith and gives righteousness. And I want to show that to you, so you know I'm not making that up. I see the idea of the promise in this little unusual phrase, to the Jew first. What does that mean? Why is Paul writing a letter to Rome and he's invoking the Jews? The power of God. Literally, gospel equals power of God. The power that saves, the power that calls from the dead, the power that will renew our world someday. It creates faith. Notice that it's to those who believe, and then in verse 17 we get faith 3 times. Revealed from faith to faith. From the very beginning to the end, it's faith. It's what you and I respond to based upon belief. And then I see that it grants righteousness. God gives us righteousness that He requires. That is the best news you could ever hear. Whether you hear it for the first time today, or whether you say, yes, I love that old truth that saved me when I was young. The gospel is God gives you what He demands of you. And anything else is a counterfeit. So let's look at this. Let's look first at the idea of the promised gospel. And I want to show you Paul's consistent. When he says to the Jew first, you and I just need to look back at verse 2 of Romans 1, not many weeks ago. He says that the gospel of God, which He promised beforehand through His prophets in the Holy Scriptures. He's saying this gospel didn't just show up on the scene. It has a history. It has a family. Maybe I can add in here some adjectives to verse 2, which He promised beforehand through His Jewish prophets in the Jewish Scriptures. What Paul is writing is he wants to say, now, you have received the gospel, you Roman Christians, but understand that it has Jewish roots. You are Johnny come lately, or Jane come lately. When you and I receive the gospel, we inherit a tradition. We get roots. You belong to the Jewish family whether you realize it or not. Verse 2, it was promised to the Jews, it was not promised to you. And that's why when Paul says it's the gospel, it's the power of God to salvation, to the Jew first, he says, I want you to know that there's a Jewish priority in your gospel. And you may have never heard that before. And if you haven't, it's because we failed as pastors. It's to all the nations, it's to all of us Gentiles. But if we have lost the Jewishness of the gospel in our minds, we've lost something. It was a Jewish feast. It was a Jewish Messiah. The gospel is Jewish. And you and I inherit that. And Paul never loses that. In fact, he's going to spend 3 chapters of 16 talking about how the gospel works with Judaism. Chapters 9, 10, 11, those controversial chapters in Romans, Paul says, now God never gave up on Israel. So I want us to see that there's Jewish promises and that you and I are Jewish converts. If you want to confuse somebody, when they say, what happened to your church on Sunday morning? You say, well, we baptized a young man. He was a Messianic Jewish convert. They'll say, you did what? So we'll just come to our church next time. A Messianic Jewish convert, he became Jewish to get saved. See, God had His people in the Old Testament. Maybe you never thought about how narrow the Old Testament is. God picks the Jews out, He blesses the Jews. He doesn't bless the Egyptians. He doesn't bless the Babylonians. This seems odd to us in our modern world where we're all rightly for equality and universality, that God would pick one people, and even within the Jews, in every generation, it's Isaac, not Ishmael. It's Jacob, not Esau. There's one family lineage. But God always planned to bless the nations. He said to Abraham, and in your seed, the Messiah, all the families of earth will be blessed. So when you and I heard the gospel, we are converts into this faith tradition. We've been grafted in. That's the image Paul's going to use in Romans 11:24. That there's a Jewish root, and God by His power has plucked us up. We're a wild branch. Many of you hate your chestnut trees that are in your yards. I've heard you grumbling about them. You don't like them. The chestnut branches, the gumball producing, you've been grafted in to this beautiful tree. We've been grafted in by God's power. We have become Jewish. We have become Jewish converts. Maybe I can put it a different way. About 80 generations ago, it would be about the time of Christ, our ancestors were pagans. Unless you're Jewish, you might be this morning, which this is not true of you. You go back about 80 generations, and nobody in all of your family lineage was ever saved. In the Old Testament, it's only the Jews. And those who come and become Jewish. Ruth gets saved. She's a Moabite. She joins the Jews. Unless you came to the Jewish God of Yahweh, you weren't saved. And now God has unveiled His mystery. He's unleashed it, and now notice Paul says it's to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. It's been expanded, and you and I have been caught up in that expansion. Jesus sent His disciples out into all the world to preach the gospel, and they did. And our ancestors heard the gospel. And somewhere in your family lineage, whether you're a first-generation Christian, and it's the first time the gospel reached your family, or your family's been Christians all the way back. You were part of those Germanic tribes that were reached early. At some point, the gospel ran into your ancestors. Paul writes in Ephesians that our ancestors were strangers to the covenant of promise, without hope and without God in the world. So this kind of resets you and I. It kind of sets us back and says, God, thank you that you sent the gospel to the whole world, because that's not what the Old Testament is. And my gospel is a Jewish gospel. It's very important that we do that. That's why Paul is going to quote from the Old Testament 78 times in this book. And then I see Jewish potential because it's to the Jew first. And here's where we have a tragic note. You would think that by and large the Jews would have embraced Jesus as the Messiah. And they did not, and they have not yet. About 15, 16 million Southern Baptists this morning. Probably less than 400,000 Messianic Jews. And that number has doubled in the last 50 years. By and large, throughout history, the Jewish people have looked at the Messiah and rejected Him. And so part of what you and I have to do is we have to remember that God still has a heart for his people. He's not abandoned them. He has a plan for the Jews. God does not abandon his people who abandon him. And so there's great hope today in our cities. There's evangelism occurring among the Jews, and you and I need to be praying for that. And you and I need to be praying that God, as the time comes to the end, we have prophecies like Romans 11, and thus all Israel will be saved. In a way still mysterious to us, God will sweep his Jewish people into the church. There's hope for the Jews. And you and I, as adopted into the family of God, need to hope for the Jews. We need to be pro-Jewish. That doesn't mean we take a political standpoint. I'm just saying ethnically you and I should love the Jews. And I think two quick applications for us. One is that you and I need to learn our family album. I know the New Testament. I know the Old Testament's hard. I spoke with one of you recently, and they were like, all those tribal land inheritances. What do those mean? I know the Old Testament's hard, but you have been adopted into a new family. Imagine if you were adopted at age 10 from a bad family to a good family. You would naturally want to get to know the family lineage. You want to know the family ins and outs. So it is for you and I. I know the Old Testament doesn't always apply directly to us, but it does apply. That's our God. That's our ancestors. We bring it down to a level you understand. If you were raised in church, Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. Remember that song? And some of your arms are starting to move, right? Don't do that. If Abraham is your father, you're Jewish. You're a redeemed Jew. And Paul is going to make that point in Romans 9 through 11. And the church in Rome needs to hear this because they're Jews and Greeks and Romans together, and they're struggling. There's an ethnic struggle in the church in Rome. Paul's going to call them to unity. And so what he wants to say is he wants to say all of you are recipients of grace. If you're a Gentile, don't be arrogant. Salvation is not from you. And if you're a Jew, be glad. Even Jesus says this in that interesting passage with the Samaritan woman, when he's presenting the gospel to her. She says, so Samaritan religion, Jewish religion, which one's right? And Jesus says, for salvation is from the Jews. So you and I need to learn the Old Testament. We need to love our heritage. We need not be just New Testament Christians only. And then you and I need to look for and pray for the salvation of the Jews. That's a good thing to add to your prayer list. Lord, would you bring your people home? Now, I believe that as Christians, we're the people of God. And they come and they join the church. They join us. But they're coming back to the family they should have been in to begin with. It's a big step for you and I. When we get saved, it's not a big step for them. They just need to embrace Jesus. You need to pray for that. And I truly believe that before the Lord returns, we'll see this great harvest of Jews. I think that's one of the reasons why he's gathering them to Israel. There are many nations, but he's gathering them together so that the gospel can sweep over them someday, and praise the Lord, they can come home. And the family of God will get married. That's the promised gospel. It's also the gospel of power. The power for salvation. I get this from the phrase, the power for salvation. Now, if you need power, it's to fix something. Right? You don't go plug in a plant you're not going to use. You don't plan to exert power and do something physical unless you have a need. So I want you to see what the problem here is. And I want to do this. I don't usually do this. Let's do this backwards. Verse 18 and then 17 and 16, I can show you the problem because that comes next week. Verse 18, wrath unleashed. See that in verse 18? For the wrath of God is revealed. God's intense hatred for sin and his intention to judge all people is verse 18. So what does he do in verse 17? Righteousness unleashed. To cover us so that you and I do not incur the right wrath of God, God gives us righteousness. Verse 17. And to do that, he has to unleash his power, verse 16. So this power is to save us. Our biggest threat, our biggest concern is God himself. I know there's concerns. They always survey people before elections. What are your number one concerns? Never do people say spiritual things. And never are they going to say, my mortal soul is in danger. But it is. God, in His wrath, will judge all people apart from Christ. And the gospel comes and says, here's the power that called the Son into existence. And here's the power that can give you the righteousness you need before God. That's the power. And so that's why I began with the Son and the creatures, because it's His power that creates and changes things in people. When God speaks, things happen. And you and I need to regain a confidence in that. And one of the ways we do that is we realize that we make a mistake. We think that it's power conveyed. We tend to think that, okay, so the gospel is being preached this morning, and as people hear the words, then somehow something changes in them. But it's not that. It's not the wires that carry the electricity. The gospel is the electricity. It is the power. When you came to faith in Christ, you heard words, or you saw words. The only way you became a Christian is the words of the gospel hit you. They might have been shared by somebody, you might have read them, you might have heard them, but at that moment you heard the gospel, God saved you. A person didn't save you, a church didn't save you, you encountered the power of God and it saved you, and that's what Paul's excited about. That kind of power. You and I live with the ability to speak that kind of power into people's lives. When the gospel is shared, it's the power of God and it changes things. And the reason why Paul is so intense about this with the Romans is because he knows this. Our confidence in the power of the gospel determines our evangelism and our eagerness. You don't know that you doubt the power of the gospel, but you probably do. You would say, I believe the gospel can save people, but you've gone a year and haven't shared the gospel with anyone. See, Pastor, I believe the gospel saved me, but it's been 10 years since I've invited somebody to church. You see, what we believe is proven by what we do. So if we have lost friends and family, neighbors and colleagues, and their lives are falling apart, and they're miserable, and their life is headed for destruction, and you and I don't speak the gospel, we're ashamed of it. That's why Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Because many of us, unfortunately, are. Your neighbor knows that you're a businessman or a homemaker, or they know everything about you. But if you said, oh, I'm a Christian too. You say, oh, really? That's interesting. I've known you 20 years, you've never said anything. You see, if you and I believe that people are miserable and broken and it's a terrible world, and that's what Paul's going to say in this chapter, and we believe the gospel can save them, if we actually believe that, we'll speak it. So, as Paul talks about the gospel, it's a call for these Roman Christians and a call for us to get very serious about evangelism. When you and I don't share the gospel, we're embarrassed by it. I wonder what's going to happen then. Their life is a wreck. I wonder who's going to help them. And our world turns to education and government and sociology and psychology. Everybody's got a solution. One of the things that everybody agrees upon is the world's a wrecked place. It's a bad place getting worse in their problems. Everybody agrees. People don't agree, they end up being institutionalized. Everybody knows there's something wrong. And the debate is what's wrong. People need education. Do they need moral slogans? Do they need a new program? Or do they need God to hit them with His power? And you and I, by our profession, by what we do, we believe the gospel is the power of God. And eagerness, this is where you and I, we get excited about tomorrow. An oxymoron's two words that shouldn't fit together. Christian pessimism should never be said. And yet it's rampant. Turn on the radio and television. Christians wringing their hands and it's so bad and what's going to happen and why? Will the gospel's power not triumph? Is God losing? Are we being set back? Never. You see, when you and I get pessimistic and we worry about this or that, and we get concerned about society and tomorrow what's going to happen? We have forgotten the power of the gospel. This is written by a murderer. This is written by a blasphemous, angry, hating murderer on his way to kill Christians, struck by the power of God. Who can your gospel not save? And what will happen? God will win. I tell you, God is not looking at the world today and saying, I'm at 90%. 90% of my will is being done. Maybe I can work really hard to get to 95%. God's plan for this world is succeeding, and it's succeeding through the gospel. And you and I should be excited. We should be optimistic. So let's learn the full power of the gospel. As we go through Romans, we're committed to that as a church. As we work through, this is just Paul's introduction. May we learn the power of the gospel. May we feel it. I know that the most terrifying thing a pastor can say to you is share the gospel. I know. Pastor, I'd die if I tried to do that. Well, no, you won't, and this letter will help you. You and I need to get confident in the power of the gospel. And if you're weak in it, just confess it to the Lord and ask for strength. I understand. There's a reason why churches are declining. There's a reason why denominations are declining. There's a reason why baptisms are declining. Because as more and more years pass, we get more and more separated from the power of the gospel. We used to believe the gospel could save people. I'm amazed at a world where we rightly laud Billy Graham for running around the world with this stupid idea the gospel could save people, that we don't do the same thing. We say, what a great man. He believed the gospel could save anyone. He went everywhere, and then we don't act like him. We hold him up and say, wow, what an amazing man. He preached the gospel to everywhere all the time. And then we struggle to do it. I understand. We need the gospel. We need Romans. Let's grow deep. And I'm with you on this. I'm not separate from you. I need to be powered up by the gospel too. Let's pray for and then pursue the spiritually dead. You need life-giving power. It would be very, very helpful for you as we work through the gospel to make a list in your head of those who are under wrath and those who are under grace. And it may be very hard to do emotionally. I have many family members that I would have to say they're under God's wrath. You need to know whether the people in your life are under wrath or under grace, because they're one or the other. And the first step to reaching them is to recognize who they are, because we believe this myth that people are somehow okay. As I've said, I have yet to meet anybody thinking about what I say, are you going to heaven or die? I've yet to meet anybody in 5 years who says, yes, I'm going to perish. Everybody I've ever talked to in Kingdom said, I'm going to heaven. It's amazing. Everybody in Kingdom is going to heaven. And you and I get caught up. We say, well, they seem okay. Let's pray for, let's get names. Give me a name of somebody to pray for in your life. Who are you praying for? Be encouraged. God can save anyone. You need names. You need people you're pursuing. You need to say, before God, I will invite. I'll take out to lunch. I will pursue. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. I'll do the same. May God transform us. It's going to take a work of grace. I know we're not great at this. No church is today. But Paul was, and this is the letter for us. It is the faith-creating gospel also. Now, I get this to everyone who believes the righteous shall live by faith. This is an intermediate step. And so you may not have thought about this before. I want to show it to you with some verses, but I want to give you the idea. If you tell us you're taking a trip to Hawaii, we assume that involves a plane flight. When you tell us you're going to Hawaii and then you tell us you're going to the airport, we don't say why. Because we know it takes a plane flight to get to Hawaii. For God to save us by grace and give us everything we need for salvation, He has to give us faith. And so that's what happens here. God's power creates faith when people hear it. I want to say that everyone who truly hears the gospel, truly hears it, has faith. Now Jesus said, while hearing they did not hear. The Roman runway to launch you, not the Romans road. We're going to get the whole thing. Because as you and I learn the gospel, we'll learn to speak it. And everybody needs to do that. Learn to rely on your gifted righteousness. In the storms of life. Listen, when things get rough, we get down. We're performers by nature. And when we have a job, and we've got a family, and we've got the right income, and everything's going well, we feel really good about ourselves. And when it all gets shaken, we feel terrible about ourselves. I can always tell somebody's faith when they're in their hospital bed. And they can't do anything. When you lose everything or everything gets shaken, do you feel the same way? You get up the day that you've lost everything and say, I'm righteous before God, I'm right? Are you borrowing? Is your significance, is your meaning of life borrowed from things in this world? Because if it is, God will shake it. So you and I cling to the righteousness. Nation fails, economy, ours, church gets burned. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happens. You and I will stand by faith with gifted righteousness at the end. That's the gospel. And you and I need to learn to stand in the storms. Because they are here. Many of you have gone through them. Many of them have ahead. And God will preserve us. Let's become more humble, more grateful. Humility and gratitude come from the gospel. Here's what happens when Christians forget the gospel. We begin to think about all the things we've done. We begin to think of all that we've accomplished, and all the years we've done this, and we begin to think of all the great things we've done for God, and I'm not denying that we've done great things. Some of you have like spiritual resumes that are like off the charts. I would not want to lay my list of accomplishments next to yours. Raise your kids, raise your grandkids, serve in the church, taught. We begin to look at these things as why we're okay. Somebody says, who are you spiritually? You say, well, I am a... You just rattle off. And we're achievers. And when you and I do that, we get prideful. And somebody says, how do you become a Christian? You say, I don't really know. I just go to church and serve the Lord. And if you and I will every day say to God, not by my own works will I be saved, it'll humble us. And the fruit will be worship. When you and I struggle to worship, we struggle to express gratitude to God corporately or privately, it's because we forgot. But when you and I remember the power of the gospel, it helps us. And then I encourage you this month, we have a new April invitation hymn. To my knowledge, we've not sung this before. I just want to give you the middle line of it. To encourage you to learn this, to sing this back to God, to mean this personally. Oh, the precious blood of Christ, the crucified. It speaks for me before the throne, where I stand justified. I'm going to give us our verse and then pray while worship team comes. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith